Hi, I'm Patrick, and today I'm looking at pranks that crossed the line to deadly. Stunts so incredibly dumb, they'll make you question how they even made it this far. From a man who kept taunting a 472-pound lion for fun, to a husband who threw his baby into a swimming pool, terrifying his wife in the worst way possible. It was January 26, 2018, a Sunday morning, at a suburban home in Austin, Texas. The backyard was narrow but well kept, the pool taking up most of the rear section behind the patio. It was already 88 degrees by 10 in the morning. Tate Drummond was 31 and had been watching short-form videos the night before when he came across a prank clip with over 12 million views. A father throws a realistic baby doll toward a pool. The mother reacts in pure panic, and the reveal produces relieved laughter. The comments were full of people tagging their partners. He ordered a weighted, realistic infant doll from an online retailer that same evening. It arrived Friday. He did not tell his wife. I've seen videos exactly like the one Tate watched. Most people have, and the comments are always the same. Hundreds of people tagging their partners, already planning to do it. This felt completely normal to him. That's the part that concerns me. On Sunday morning, he set up 3 cameras, one on the patio pergola facing the pool, one inside the kitchen window, and one handheld. He put their infant daughter, Poppy, in her bouncer in the living room with the baby monitor on, and retrieved the doll from the spare room. Zara was outside cleaning the pool with a telescopic brush, her back partially turned to the house. At 10:20 a.m., Tate came out carrying Poppy. Zara told him to take Poppy back inside without breaking her work rhythm. She said she did not want to worry about the baby while she had chemicals out. Her tone was practical. She turned back to the pool. Tate went inside, put Poppy back in her bouncer, wrapped the doll in the same muslin cloth Poppy was usually swaddled in, and went back outside. He waited 4 minutes. Then he shouted Zara's name. She turned. He threw the doll in a high arc toward the center of the pool, shouting at her to catch it. Zara reacted instantly. Her mind registered only one thing: her daughter over the water. She was already running before the doll reached the peak of its arc, her eyes fixed on the bundle instead of the ground ahead. The pool coping rose about 1.5 inches above the patio surface. Her leading foot caught it at full stride. Her momentum carried her body forward while her feet stopped. She did not dive. She did not fall into the water. She went straight down, the full weight of her body driving her forehead into the tiled coping edge before she could bring her hands up. The sound was sharp and immediate. She collapsed face down on the coping and did not move. Tate reached her within seconds. She was unconscious, blood already spreading across the tiles. The doll floated face down in the shallow end as he called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Zara was transported to a medical center with a severe traumatic brain injury, a depressed frontal skull fracture, and significant intracranial bleeding. She underwent emergency neurosurgery that afternoon to relieve pressure and control the bleeding before being placed on life support. She did not regain consciousness. On the 3rd day, scans showed no meaningful brain activity. The damage was extensive and irreversible. Zara Drummond was removed from life support on the evening of the 5th day and pronounced dead at 9:47 p.m. She was 29 years old. The cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury and intracranial hemorrhage consistent with high-force impact on a hard surface. Tate surrendered all 3 cameras to police voluntarily and did not delete any footage. The investigation reviewed the material in full. No charges were filed. The finding noted the absence of intent and the unforeseeable nature of the specific injury mechanism. Poppy was collected by Zara's mother that afternoon and remained there through the funeral and beyond. Tate set up 3 cameras for a prank that took his daughter's mother in 5 days. The next case didn't involve a pool or a doll or any setup at all. Just a teacher who had been waiting weeks for his turn and ran out his front door laughing. It was May 26, 2017, a Friday night on a quiet residential street in Springfield, Missouri. The neighborhood was the kind where porch lights stayed off after 9, and dogs did not bother to bark at passing cars. Mr. David Hartley was 53 and had taught 10th and 11th grade English at a high school for 19 years. He was the kind of teacher students remembered, not because he was easy, but because he was present. He knew which students were struggling before they said anything. He stayed after class. His colleagues described him as steady. His students described him as someone who actually gave a damn. The Leaf tradition at a high school had been running for at least a decade. At the end of each school year, a group of senior students would select one teacher they respected, drive to that teacher's home late on a Friday night, and cover their entire front yard in leaves. Bags of them, sometimes dozens, collected over weeks. The goal was to arrive undetected, complete the job, and be gone before anyone noticed. If the teacher came out and caught them, the prank was over. Getting caught was the ending, not the escalation. Mr. Hartley had known about the tradition for years. By May of that year, he had started to suspect his turn was close. A few of his 11th grade students had been unusually pleasant in the weeks leading up to the end of term. One had asked with no obvious reason whether he lived far from school. He had smiled and said nothing. He told his wife about it that same week. He said he was looking forward to catching them. I've said before that the details that get me are never the big ones. It's always something small. And here it's this. He was looking forward to catching them. He was genuinely excited to be part of the prank. On that night, 6 11th grade students loaded 4 cars with 32 bags of dry leaves collected from parks and sidewalks across the district over the preceding 3 weekends. They drove separately and parked at staggered distances from Hartley's street on the quiet residential neighborhood where porch lights stayed off after 9 and dogs did not bother to bark at passing cars. They had agreed on silence, no phone flashlights, and a 10-minute maximum on the ground. 2 acted as lookouts. 4 went to work on the yard. By 11:40 p.m., they had emptied all 32 bags across the front lawn, the garden beds, and the path to the front door. The yard was completely buried. They were gathering the empty bags to leave when the porch light came on. Mr. Hartley appeared at the front door in sweatpants and a hoodie. He had been awake. He saw the figures on his lawn and immediately understood what was happening. He came down the front steps fast, calling out to them by name. The students scattered. Most ran toward the parked cars. One ran the wrong way toward the road end of the street and stopped at the corner under a streetlight, doubled over and looking back at him. Mr. Hartley ran toward that student. He was moving fast, still laughing, covering the sidewalk in long strides. He did not see the concrete curb drop at the edge of the driveway crossing. His leading foot came down expecting flat ground and found a step down of about 6 inches. His ankle folded. His body pitched forward and he went down hard, his chest and face hitting the road surface as he rolled off the curb and into the lane. A refrigerated freight truck traveling at the posted limit of 35 miles per hour had no time to stop. The driver felt the impact before he understood it. He pulled over about 400 feet past the point of collision and called 911 at 11:48 p.m. Paramedics arrived at 11:56 p.m. Mr. Hartley was deceased at the scene. The cause of death was catastrophic traumatic injury consistent with a heavy vehicle strike. The 6 students were identified within 48 hours. All cooperated, and none had a prior record. The investigation found no evidence of intent to cause harm. The inquest recorded the death as accidental. No charges were filed. The high school canceled its end-of-year assembly. His 11th grade class finished their final exams 11 days later, supervised by a substitute teacher none of them knew. The student who had been standing at the corner under the streetlight did not return to school for the remainder of the term. The leaf tradition has not been repeated since. He was laughing when he fell. The kids were laughing. That's the part I couldn't shake. That the last sound he made in his life was probably a good one. David's life ended right on that road, but what comes next is different. It happened between a brother and his sister. I didn't want to include this one, I'll be honest about that, but I think you need to hear it. It was March 5th, 2019, a Tuesday evening, inside a 2-story brick home in Mississauga, Ontario. The living room faced the staircase directly, separated by about 13 feet of open floor. Ayla Brennan was 17 and had come home from her part-time cafe shift, showered, and settled into the armchair nearest the staircase with a bag of chips and her phone. She was not paying attention to the room. The chair sat close enough to the bottom step that the right armrest nearly touched the newel post. Jackson Brennan was 14 and had been pranking his sister since middle school. He documented everything on his phone, kept most of it in a private folder, and sent some to his group chat. Ayla had complained to their parents twice in the past month. Their mother had told him to grow up. He had nodded and said nothing. Earlier that day, Jackson had found a lifelike baby doll in a box of old toys in the basement. It was dressed in a pale yellow jumpsuit. He laid it flat on the living room floor midway between the television and Ayla's chair, face up with its arms slightly extended. He tied a length of thin nylon fishing line to its ankle, ran the line along the baseboard and under the hallway door, and crouched on the other side with the spool loose in his hands. Ayla had been on her phone for most of the evening. At some point, she glanced up. The doll was moving. Short, uneven pulls across the floor toward her chair, the pale yellow jumpsuit shifting with each tug of the line. She screamed and threw herself out of the chair in a single panicked motion, spinning toward the hallway. She did not register the staircase directly behind her. Her heel caught the bottom step while her body was still carrying forward momentum. The stairs took her. She went backward, her body rolling and striking each step without control. Nothing to grab in time to slow herself. She hit the bottom of the staircase with a single hard impact and stopped moving. Jackson came through the hallway door within seconds. Ayla was on her back at the foot of the stairs, one leg twisted beneath her, completely still. She was making a faint, continuous low sound. He called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Ayla was unresponsive to verbal commands. Responders identified a suspected spinal injury and immobilized her on scene before transporting her to hospital. She died in the early hours of the following morning. The cause of death was cervical spinal fracture with complete cord transection and traumatic brain injury sustained during the fall. Jackson was interviewed at the hospital with a parent present. He described the prank in full without being prompted. The fishing line was still tied to the doll when investigators processed the scene. Police completed their investigation and submitted findings to the Crown. No charges were laid, though a victim services report was filed and the case remained on file. The doll was still on the living room floor when the first officers arrived. Meanwhile, the next story involves someone who was already fragile, already recovering, and I want you to hold that in mind as I walk you through it, because it was a 15-year-old boy who wanted his grandfather to laugh. He didn't have the ending he expected. It was June 9th, 2021, a Wednesday afternoon, inside a single-story brick home in Liège, Belgium. The curtains in the front room were half drawn against the afternoon heat. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. The television was on in the corner, volume low, tuned to a daytime program nobody was watching. Raymond Sellers was 68 and had been home for 11 days after spending 3 weeks at the hospital following an ischemic stroke. The stroke had left him with partial paralysis down his left side, reduced grip strength in both hands, and a speech pattern that required effort to produce clearly. His doctors said meaningful recovery was possible with physiotherapy and rest. What he needed above everything else was stillness and the complete avoidance of physical or emotional stress. His daughter had converted the front sitting room of their single-story brick home in Liège into a temporary bedroom so he would not need to navigate stairs. He spent most of his day in a hospital-grade wheelchair, moving between the sitting room and the back garden, where he liked to sit in the late afternoon. Raymond had always been the kind of grandfather who engaged. Backyard games, card games at the kitchen table, bad jokes delivered with complete commitment. The teenagers had grown up with that version of him. Seeing him in the wheelchair was an adjustment none of them spoke about directly. Let me be real here. I know how it feels being ill and having a support system. Raymond was actually enjoying it. Kobe Renshaw was 16 and Raymond's grandson. His teachers described him as easily distracted, but good-natured. He spent considerable time watching prank content online and owned a small handheld novelty shock device bought from a joke shop 4 months earlier. He had used it on 3 friends at school and once on his younger sister. None of them had been seriously affected. On that afternoon, Raymond was sitting in his wheelchair near the back door facing the garden. He had been in good spirits that day. He had eaten lunch without difficulty and had been more talkative than usual. Kobe had been sitting with him for 20 minutes, showing him videos on his phone, including the shock device pranks, and Raymond had laughed at 2 of them, the laugh coming out slower and more effortful than it used to, but genuine. Kobe retrieved the shock device from his hoodie pocket and held it against the back of Raymond's right hand and triggered it. Raymond's body jolted sharply in the chair. His head snapped back. For 2 or 3 seconds, he made a sound that was almost a laugh. Kobe was already grinning, pulling the device back. Then Raymond's expression changed. The color left his face immediately. His breathing became uneven. His left hand slid from the armrest. His head dropped forward. His body listed to the right, and the wheelchair, which had not been locked, rolled slightly. He went sideways out of the chair and down onto the tiled floor before Kobe could reach him. Kobe shouted for his mother. She found Raymond on the floor, conscious but unable to respond properly to her voice, his breathing shallow and irregular. She called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes. His blood pressure was critically elevated, and he was showing signs consistent with a second acute cerebrovascular event. Doctors later believed the sudden panic and stress response had likely triggered a dangerous spike in blood pressure in a patient whose vascular system was already severely compromised from the earlier stroke. He was transported to a university hospital under emergency conditions. He died later that evening. The cause of death was determined to be a second ischemic stroke occurring in the context of severe pre-existing cerebrovascular damage and acute cardiovascular stress. Kobe was interviewed by police with his parents present. He surrendered the device and described what he had done without minimizing it. He had not known. That was the consistent and uncontested finding. No charges were filed. Raymond's wheelchair remained in the back room for weeks after the funeral, still facing the garden where the flowers had just come into bloom. After researching this next one, I almost pulled it from the batch entirely, because it involves a dumb decision. Far in Brazil, a man decided to house a lion and decided the lion's mealtime was a time to have fun. It was February 20th, 2017, a Thursday afternoon, on a private rural estate outside Sorocaba, São Paulo State, Brazil. The land ran to about 106 acres of red-earthed pasture and scrub. The main house sat on a rise at the center. A reinforced secondary structure sat about 260 feet to the north. Renato Figueiredo was 44 and had made his money in agricultural land brokerage. By his late 30s, he had accumulated enough to withdraw from active work entirely. He had loved lions since childhood. When he had enough money to act on it, he did not hesitate. Private ownership of big cats in Brazil was illegal outside licensed zoos and research facilities, though enforcement in remote rural areas was inconsistent. Renato had the land, the structure, and enough distance from anyone who might ask questions. The lion, a 4-year-old male Renato had named Simba, had been transported from the Paraguayan border through a cross-border arrangement. He weighed 472 pounds at his last recorded measurement. Renato photographed him regularly and posted images to a private social media account. Friends responded with a mixture of admiration and concern. I want to pause here for a second, because Renato had fired the one person on his property who actually knew what they were doing. Then he was alone out there with a 472-pound lion and a camera. I'm baffled. Over the year following the departure of his caretaker, Renato developed what he described to friends as a relationship with Simba. He had begun presenting meat at the feeding window, allowing Simba to approach, and then withdrawing it at the last moment before sliding it through. He filmed it several times. In one video, he laughed audibly as Simba's head snapped forward and found nothing. A friend commented that he was going to get himself killed. Renato replied with a laughing emoji. He had been doing it for 7 months. On that afternoon, Renato approached the enclosure at the usual feeding time, carrying about 6.5 pounds of raw beef. The heat was pushing 100 degrees. He raised the sliding panel and extended the meat into the opening. Simba came to the window. Renato pulled the meat back. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Simba did not follow the meat. He lunged forward and drove his head partially through the feeding window, his jaws closing on Renato's right arm at the mid-forearm. Both forearm bones fractured on contact. The lion pulled back through the opening, taking Renato's arm with it to the elbow before the angle of the window frame arrested the motion. Renato's screaming was heard at the main house by his housekeeper, who called emergency services at 3:14 p.m. Renato was conscious when first responders arrived, but in severe hemorrhagic shock. Simba had not released the arm. A veterinarian was dispatched from Sorocaba. The sedation process took 22 minutes from arrival to full effect. Renato was transported to hospital with a traumatic degloving injury from the mid-forearm to the wrist, complete fracture of both forearm bones, and vascular damage to the brachial artery. His surgical team described his condition as critical on arrival. He received emergency vascular surgery and was placed in intensive care. He died at 11:52 p.m. The cause of death was hemorrhagic shock secondary to traumatic vascular injury sustained in an animal attack. Authorities attended the property the following morning. Simba and 2 wildcats in an adjoining section were seized. Simba was euthanized on site. An investigation was opened into the origin and transport of the animals. 3 individuals connected to the cross-border brokerage were identified for questioning. The next story I'm going to leave you with today is the one that stayed with me the longest. It was clever and was actually well planned, but the ending was a total disaster. It was October 31st, 2019, Halloween night, on a suburban street in Naperville, Illinois. The neighborhood was active in patches, porch lights left on for passing children, small groups moving between properties with bags already heavy by 7 in the evening. Sienna Hartley was 34 and worked at a radiology clinic. She had finished her shift 2 hours earlier than expected and driven home in good spirits, already thinking about the night. She and her husband Dane had been together for 9 years, married for 5. He was not easy to scare. She had tried before and he had laughed both times before she had even finished setting up. He had a way of seeing things coming. She decided this time would be different. Sienna changed into a full-length white dress she had bought for a costume party 2 years earlier and applied pale theatrical makeup across her face and hands. She pulled a sheer white fabric over her head that partially obscured her features. She texted her closest friend, Brooke Sanderson, 29, and explained the plan. Brooke agreed immediately. "I have to be honest, the planning in this one is what gets me." She had put real thought into this. She wanted to finally get him, and she did. Dane was 36 and worked as a site supervisor for a civil construction company. He arrived home at 6:48 p.m., changed, and was sitting in the living room with a beer when his phone rang at 7:15 p.m. It was Brooke. She told him there had been an incident, that Sienna had been in a minor accident on the way home from a dinner she had supposedly been attending, that she was shaken but okay and needed him to come quickly to an address 2 suburbs over. She used a tone of controlled urgency she had practiced once in the car before calling. Dane was out the front door in under 2 minutes. Sienna had been lying flat across the back seat of his car for just over 20 minutes. She had climbed in through the rear passenger door while he was inside changing, pulling the door to without fully latching it to avoid the sound. Dane, already rushing after hearing Brooke's call, never walked around the vehicle before getting in. As he drove, his attention stayed fixed on the navigation screen and the repeated calls Brooke sent to keep him moving quickly. The angle of the driveway and the height of the rear seats kept her out of view from the front. She heard him unlock the car and get in. Dane reversed out of the driveway and pulled onto the street, driving with urgency, phone mounted on the dash with the address already loaded in navigation. He merged onto the main road and accelerated to the posted limit of 35 miles per hour. Sienna waited until he had been driving for approximately 90 seconds. Then she slowly raised herself upright in the back seat and reached one hand forward, placing it on his right shoulder. Dane reacted before he could think. His body twisted sharply to the right, his hands pulling the wheel with it. The car crossed the center line. He overcorrected left. The vehicle lost stability and rotated, the passenger side striking a parked van on the opposite curb, before continuing into a utility pole and coming to rest. Sienna was unrestrained in the back seat. The impact threw her forward and then sideways. Her head struck the doorframe before she came to rest on the floor behind the driver's seat. She did not make a sound after that. Dane was conscious. His airbag had deployed. He had a laceration across his forearm and a deep bruise forming across his sternum from the seatbelt. He turned around and found her on the floor, still in the white dress. She was breathing. He called 911 at 7:21 p.m. Paramedics arrived at 7:28 p.m. Sienna was extracted and transported to hospital with a severe traumatic brain injury consistent with blunt force impact. She underwent emergency surgery that night. She died on November 3rd, 4 days later, without having regained consciousness. The cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury sustained during the collision. Dane was treated at the scene for minor injuries and interviewed by police the following morning. Brooke was also interviewed. Both gave full accounts. The investigation investigation found no evidence of criminal offending. The coroner recorded the death as accidental. Dane did not return to the house for 6 weeks. When he did, the plastic skeletons were still zip-tied to the mailboxes on either side of his driveway. The neighbors had forgotten to take them down. The last story I looked into started with something different. One moment everything was fine, then the next moment it wasn't. It was September 18, 2019, in Seville, Spain. The block sat quiet most evenings after closing hours, bordered on one side by a shadowed alley barely 6 feet wide. A single illuminated sign above the shop's side entrance jutted outward from the brick wall, suspended by 2 aging metal brackets that had been rattling loose for nearly a week. Mateo Vargas was 17 years old and lived 2 blocks from the shop. He had spent most of his teenage years working small jobs around the neighborhood, including occasional weekend shifts at his uncle's garage, sweeping floors and helping with basic inventory. He was considered dependable. Family members trusted him with minor tasks without concern. He had climbed onto the shop roof once before during a previous repair and had not reported any problems. That evening, his uncle Javier had asked him before locking up to bring a couple of friends and tighten the sign's loose mounting bolts before the overnight storm arrived. Just after 10 p.m., Mateo arrived at the back of the shop with 2 friends from the neighborhood, Ivan and Sergio, both 16. They brought a flashlight, an adjustable wrench, and an aluminum maintenance ladder pulled from inside the garage. The streets had already gone quiet. The only sounds were distant highway traffic and the low hum of nearby air conditioning units. None of them brought any safety equipment. The rooftop was flat, but poorly maintained. Loose gravel covered most of the surface in uneven patches. Ventilation pipes and electrical conduit ran in several directions across the surface. The illuminated sign extended roughly 4 feet out from the wall above the alley entrance. To reach the outer bracket properly, a person had to crouch near the roof's edge and lean forward over open air approximately 22 feet above the alley floor. Mateo worked through the upper bolts one at a time while Ivan held the flashlight. Sergio drifted around the rooftop without purpose, kicking at loose pebbles and making noise about shadows in the alley below. The repair took close to 20 minutes and proceeded without incident until the final bracket. The outer bracket continued to shift under pressure. Each time Mateo applied torque with the wrench, the frame moved instead of the bolt threading tighter. He repositioned himself several times, eventually planting his right foot near the roof's edge to get a better angle on the hardware. Loose gravel shifted slightly beneath his shoe as he leaned forward toward the sign frame. Earlier that evening, after watching a football match at a cafe downtown, Sergio had picked up a small portable air horn during the street celebrations outside. He had carried it in his backpack all evening without using it. Standing behind one of the rooftop ventilation units and watching Mateo crouch near the ledge, he removed it quietly. Ivan noticed and said nothing and just chuckled. At this point, all I can say is that this is very dumb. Then he blew it once across the open rooftop. Mateo's body reacted before his mind could process the source. He jerked backward sharply, and the sole of his right shoe dragged across the loose gravel near the ledge. He reached out for the sign frame to steady himself. The loosened outer bracket twisted violently under his grip instead of holding. The entire sign frame lurched outward from the wall. He remained partially upright for less than 2 seconds. Then he went over the edge. The fall was approximately 22 feet onto a concrete alley floor. He landed on his back and right side. He did not move after impact. The air horn clattered out of Sergio's hand and rolled across the rooftop gravel. Neither boy moved for several seconds, then both ran to the ledge. Ivan called emergency services at 10:31 p.m. The call lasted under a minute. He gave the address and said his friend had fallen from a roof. He did not mention the air horn during the call. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and found Mateo unresponsive in the alley. He had sustained a severe traumatic brain injury from the impact, along with fractures to 3 ribs, his right clavicle, and his right forearm. He was transported to a hospital in critical condition. Mateo Vargas died the following morning at 7:14 a.m. He had not regained consciousness. Ivan and Sergio were brought in for questioning separately the same night at the local police station. Both were accompanied by their parents. Sergio disclosed the air horn during his interview after initially omitting it from his account. Investigators recovered the device from the rooftop the following morning. Both teenagers were released into parental custody. Mateo's family did not speak publicly after his death. His uncle closed the shop for 2 weeks following the incident.